Welcome to another episode of ModOps Pod, the Modern Operations Podcast. I got the chance recently to talk with Russ Steiger, the Principal Security Solutions Architect with Evolving Solutions. He shared his perspective on making cybersecurity actually effective and some insights on what he sees coming in the cybersecurity realm. I hope you enjoyed my conversation as much as I did. Russ, well, I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So before we dive into some of the really cool things that are going on in the security space and some of the, I would say, innovative thinking that you're bringing to the field, I just wanted to maybe get a little bit of your background, sort of what got you into security in the first place.
Sure. So kind of an odd start. I was an 80s hacker kid, air quotes around that. First computer was a Trash 80 in 1979 and sort of graduated up through the land of Tandy and eventually to the PS2 world. And that's a personal computer, not PlayStation 2. And then got in my first taste of the Unix world in 93 or 94 and kind of really operated in computer science as sort of more of a hobby, something that was tangential to most of the things I did. So always kept an eye on it. The security part for, majority of the early part of my career, but my first, corporate gig was as a kind of creating and operating a call center for a software development company. So as part of that, there was some natural enrollment of security to that, which got me into medical imaging. And I was a DICOM engineer, which is a transfer syntax for medical images. And so this was as HIPAA was emerging. So there was a bit of that. It was a little bit uncertain in the earlier days as opposed to now. And then at some point, I just decided I really want to get into security. So I took a big pay cut and took a job running a vulnerability scanner for a level 4 PCI company, scanning fast food and quick retail, doing their internal, external scans. And then kind of just from that starting point, I ran up through the course of just graduating from one thing to bigger responsibilities down the line, and eventually got to a point where I was, built a great metrics program for a large medical device manufacturer, and then that grew into designing their security operations center, poaching all of my staff from the other employer, and then designing the threat intelligence program to put some context over the things that the SOC could see, which got me on the radar of the integrator side. I was also a pen tester for 4 years in parallel to that time at the medical device manufacturer. So a lot of good spread of, experiences that made it, somewhat more valuable to be on the integrator side. So I made that jump about 8 years ago. And, kind of been just enjoying the ride, being able to help clients that way. And that was really the desire I had when I worked for a specific employer. My desire was always to try to force multiply my knowledge or experience to many other institutions. I'd do these talks for RSA or CompTIA, Recorded Future, and people would line up after I was done with my talk at the side of the stage to ask me questions like, I'm a analyst trying to break in, or I'm a CIO, like, what do I do next? And you can't really help them as you're running down the hallway to your next talk. So I found that this was really quite the perfect role. So that's kind of how I got to this flavor of security.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned building out a metrics program, and we've talked before about how critical that sort of piece of the security puzzle is being able to unearth the appropriate risk and operational metrics that get a company closer to where they need to be. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of how you approach that and what your perspective is now with clients?
Yeah, and I mean, the thing that's fascinating about this is that I think because of the sort of ephemeral condition of security, that things pop up very quickly, that, nobody's warned that a 0-day or vulnerability is ahead. I mean, that's sort of what makes them profitable for attackers. Mm-hmm. It's that sort of shocking discovery element that security as a practice has been really kind of just running around shooting and moving, but hasn't really set a policy for, what kind of weapon does it carry and how does it, set up some rules for engagement. So metrics are largely an afterthought for most organizations if they tackle them at all. And when I sit down with a CISO, generally my question to them is like, what metrics do you collect? who gets to see them and what do you do with them? And invariably you get a mix of answers, but most times it's, we'd love to do that at some point. Right now we're just too busy doing other things. And my philosophy is that the being too busy to do that because you're doing other things is really a symptom of an imperfect or poor metric system. So for a lot of our enterprise organizations that are trying to establish a ground rule on, what do we do in policy? How do we understand our risk? There's a huge lack of, a practical approach to that. And I think, there are a lot of different standards and, concepts that people can use to go after it. But I think it's really overthought by the industry, and that's what scares people away from it, or they just get exhausted by the idea of attacking it, and they don't start with the basics, like, what can we see, what can't we see, and is that itself a metric?
Well, and I think that to me feels like the core of it, right? If you uh, knowing what to do is sort of the paralysis that we oftentimes see in clients. I mean, they're obviously checking the boxes, so they get their cybersecurity or cyber insurance rates down to where they need to be, or to meet the regulatory standard that they're being held to. But then it feels like they're frequently stuck. They're frozen. They don't know what to do. That seems like the metrics piece and sort of getting that metrics gives you that first step or that rung up to be able to figure out where you need to go attack first.
Yeah, absolutely. And a way to think about that is that if you like, a lot of enterprise organizations have very thin security budgets, right? They just
Yep.
are buying largely the minimum, requirement that they need for whatever the problem is, something that's really hurt them, and they go after that. And that could be the lot of the budget, right? That one
Yeah.
of the things that I've expressed to CISOs, CIOs, and organizations willing to hear it is that if you come into an organization that says, hey, budgets, your hands are tied, right? Like I think that some of these operators maybe overthink it and don't realize that just that there isn't a cost necessarily to putting together at least a strategy for metrics.
Yeah.
That going and doing that, if you're, as a CIO or CISO, your job is really to illustrate risk, to find risk where you can, and then to illustrate the cost of doing business with that risk. And that, and then the cost of doing nothing, right? And to express that back to the business. That's round one. Everything that comes after that is, if you're enabled with a budget, it's most likely going to be better enabled because you've gone to the business and said, these are the costs for operating this way, right? Or
Yeah.
that if they don't understand that their job at the get-go is like, if that risk registration system that includes metrics that tell you sort of which way the wind is blowing doesn't exist, that is your job, right? It's not to go find an email security tool or an endpoint tool. It's to decide like what does that tool need to be doing for us, right? It's a requirements for risk registry.
How accurate is it to say that metrics, those risk registry, is the bridge between sort of a framework and the practical application of a set of cybersecurity principles and implementation tools, technology inside of an organization?
Well, yeah, and so that's, I mean, because if you the premise of that is, let's assume there's a capable risk registry in place.
Yeah.
There's a governance, risk, and compliance function to the organization that has said, hey, whether we've got the tools or not, these are the things we care about, right? And
Yep.
that might be we're susceptible to a certain kind of malware because of the way we create our endpoints, or we get too much rain in Penang and we can't put products in boxes, right? There's
Right.
a
Right.
whole litany of kinds of things that constitute risk. How the business reacts to those is really, first off, a scale of prioritization to say, how do we judge these things, fairly to say
Right.
that
Yeah.
this would end business for us. And then the other end of it is how do we enable ourselves to actually counteract that? So the when another concept we throw around in security a lot is this idea of zero trust, right? Zero
Yep.
trust really is building a robot that can take objective and subjective risk elements and then create reactions or orchestrations that say, in certain if then conditions, the organization does this to minimize risk or hopefully eliminate it. So that disconnect between the governance end, where these risk registries and metrics are created and most, um, constantly housed, to the practical SOC level or identity level where they're being employed as policies to provision users, counteract cyber threats, right? Whatever that is. The disconnect there usually is that, again, it's back to this shoot and move problem where the the material application of security science in an organization is just so constantly in the firefighting mode that they don't go back and do these sort of post-mortem effects with this governance element to say, yeah, we're working on some of these risks, or here's how we're doing that. And they operate in silos. And that's largely because exactly what you said is there's a checkbox mentality. And for a lot of organizations, GRC satisfies their requirement to the company by making sure that auditors and anybody who's using like a COBIT system or any other standard for measuring an organization's compliance, that like that's what they worry about, but they don't
Right.
really think about translating it down to the tool or practice level.
Well, and that, I mean, you're hitting on another point for me, which is what you just described is completely accurate, and I can grok it. I can understand where you're coming from. It also sounds very complex, and I think that's the other place where organizations sometimes get hung up is you've got this uh, interactive web of risk and tools and procedures and policies and implementation in reality. And back to your point earlier, some of that risk may be completely outside of the cyber domain, right? If it rains in Penang and I can't put stuff in boxes, that's a risk.
Right.
There's nothing I can do with my technology to stop that or change that. So bubbling down what are the things that can be addressed by technology or risk, and then actually operationalizing it through a set of tools has a level of complexity that seems daunting to a lot of organizations. Um, and I'm curious in your experience where you've seen people be successful with that, and sort of what are some of the principles that you take to be able to deal with that level of complexity.
Sure, and let's attack that in reverse. Let's talk about the principles which sort of dictate capabilities. So I always, when I talk to organizations about establishing metrics, I really try to have them focus their efforts into two different disciplines. One are static metrics, which are the things you always care about, right? Like how much phishing email do we get, or how many breaches have we had? What's our time to respond against certain, threats? And then dynamic metrics, which are the things that are measurements of certain sprints or projects you have to do some betterment of your environment, right? That might be we're switching from one endpoint solution to another. Like how many of our total endpoint count has made that transition? How many machines have we patched after a certain vulnerability has been announced, right? So that you have a sense of one in static metrics. You're helping the governance organization understand what investment is really turning around to do for the company in a very broad sense of tooling, staffing, putting a process in place. And then the other side, in the dynamic, it operates for the organization to say, if we do have these things in column A, the static line,
Mhm.
column B, this dynamic stuff is actually the cost of execution to get static in place. So
Sure.
you can look at it that way, right? Those two piles. So I think that helps organizations understand, because I mean, obviously you can draw endless numbers of measurements or find places to draw logs that you could create metrics around, but really understanding what those most critical operational ones are usually it's a great start to go after and saying, what are my static and what are my dynamic metrics, to get a sense of how you go after the logging or insights that you need to populate both. You begin to learn a lot about yourself.
Yeah, and that's a great transition maybe to a slightly different topic. The metrics give you the insight. You've got your metrics. I figured out what my static and my dynamic metrics are. I've got my toolbox of some kind that already lives inside of my organization. What's the process to get those tools to operationalized in a way that delivers value against those metrics that you start to see the outcomes that you're talking about realizing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we always have to start any good metrics effort with a baseline, right? Like,
Yep.
how much does it hurt today? Understanding that, and then inside that visibility, right, that baseline, you cannot make assumptions that's telling you the whole truth.
Sure.
So it's valuable to, like, I've had some government, states, state governments that have come to me and discussed how to do this for, they've got legislatures given them a huge budget, said, hey, cybersecurity is popular. Let's go after understanding how we can be better. And right out of the gate, the first thing I suggest them is like, it's about drawing back some of these really objective things like about vulnerabilities and how your organization is built at the network level, but it's also about issuing surveys to IT managers and maybe even random users and say like, where do you see problems in the way that we execute the business? And by doing that, you narrow down the potential that that baseline information you're using to make certain decisions or how you're going to autonomize your project of getting better visibility and better tool rationalization and application in your environment, it becomes a little less of a binary, it's good or bad, or like, that baseline has a little more texture to it. So
Sure.
then when you go to do the tool translation to actually apply making changes to your environment, you can say, first you have to measure how that baseline is a product of inferior tooling or inferior configuration. And then using that, you can really work with, either the manufacturer of those tools or an integrator like Evolving Solutions to say, are we really doing this the right way? And if there are findings that we're not, let's stay with the baseline we've got, make those changes, and then see what the offset is, right? So then you get sort of a delta between, the way you were doing it and the way you should have been doing it. And at that newer level, the way you should have been doing it's been measured. If that still has, inherent risks or it's missing things, that's when you start to talk about, that's tools rationalization. That's when you start to talk about we replace this, or we need to integrate this with other tools to draw more value out of it, or we need to get more bespoke correlations, novel correlations in our sim between this and something else to try to create some sort of security trigonometry to know two sides and an angle, right, to find those unknown unknowns.
Yeah, and so that leads me a little bit to my next question, which is, okay, I've got my metrics figured out. I've obviously defined my risk registry ahead of time. I've got some rationalization of tools or some integration of tools. Maybe it's adding, maybe it's integrating what I've got. I'm in a place where I'm, at least for the moment, addressing the risk space that I can see right now. That whole platform is going to be under pressure from constantly changing risks or new risks. How's that how do those platform choices help you be able to respond to that? Or what do you need to do differently even to be able to think future proof, for lack of a better way of saying it?
Yeah, in a very objective sense, in most organizations, it's really this is pretty basic, but connecting the GRC, governance, risk, and compliance element of the organization to the day-to-day experiences of a SOC or an
Sure.
identity program, right? So that they get a sense of like, how realistic are our abstractions about risk in our environment? Are we like kind of tracking with what's actually going on? Given the quick changes that occur to the threatscape, the organization has to be able to say, one, when those things emerge, right? Like having a robust threat intelligence program to say these matter to us or they don't, and then saying, based upon, it does matter to us. To what degree does it affect us, and how can we monitor that, right? So there's a home for dynamic metrics in that specific attempt to tune the environment against like a rapidly changing, again,
Yeah.
ephemeral threatscape, right?
Yeah.
That really is that ability to have that feedback mechanism result in changes to measurement
Yeah.
is critical.
No, and that completely makes sense. So having built that metrics framework gives you the tools you need almost to be able to measure your success at dealing with a dynamic threatscape.
Yeah, and I mean, think about it from a CIO's perspective.
Yeah.
They are their best day is when they get a budget approved, right? So what and that's really what their job is to take risks out of the CISO's desk and translate those into the international business language, right? Money.
Yep.
And then take those back and say, hey, again, we have a problem, these are our options, this is the cost of doing nothing, right? And the translating that story is, you know, largely for people who do not speak security that will end up signing the checks or approving those budgets.
Mhm.
You can't operate inside that language. You have to put that in practical visual, like actual visual terms, right? So pie charts and graphs, right, to explain the value of investments you've made, the problem with investments you haven't made, and the potential or opportunity for investments you can make. And yeah, so they're if you can help the CIO, you know, justify budgets, right? Or the CIO can help themselves justify budget by having
Mhm.
really good ways of describing the security risks outside that vernacular, then you're really doing some impressive stuff. And this is just again not that common. And I think that fundamental, grasping those fundamentals could be transformative for a lot of industries.
Yeah. So let me extend that a little bit more then. So the other thing that we've seen a lot in the last couple of decades is business-driven IT changes that result in risk. The first most obvious one to me was cloud, right? Where you
Hmm.
start having outside parties, your businesses, the CEO is coming down to the CIO and saying, "What's our cloud strategy?" Right?
Yep.
That seems pretty passe and sort of um, almost naive now, because now we're talking about what's your AI strategy.
Yeah.
The How does that sort of baseline that you've built, those dynamic metrics you've built, sort of help you deal with that? And what are the different or maybe nuanced threats that start to show up as you start thinking about an AI strategy that might make you choose to do something different with that sort of baseline security posture?
Sure. So we have like two legitimate pools of concern. We talk about AI. One is the business using it to their benefit, right?
Yep. Yep.
What tools exist, and then having some governance around that, right? Certainly and that we might call that, data loss prevention or DLP considerations, right? Like,
Mhm.
employees making their lives, they think, simpler by uploading spreadsheets with sensitive information into them, not realizing or not caring that that information is being aggregated into the collective, right? The data lake that represents that AI, that
Yep.
LLM now is partly, spiked with their information. There's inherent risk there, and there's some popular, situations in the papers about that. The other side of the AI part is that we now, have attackers who need no technical skill. They don't even need to have a target selection. They can simply go to some of these agentic AI capabilities and say, I have a desire to make money off of cybercrime. What are some ideas? And then just continue to go down rabbit holes until, they have something generating, attack plan with executable code, and so on. So the problem becomes that our low hanging fruit is a lot less certain in the
Sure.
AI landscape. We don't know what people are trying to do because there are just so many different attack vectors now being formed by this multitude of operators. But then if we go back to the AI for the governance story about how the organization uses it, I think the same problem is happening with this as happened with cloud. If we rewind 15, 20 years ago, when that really started to emerge as a cost savings method, like moving to
Uh-huh.
cloud cost savings method, right? A lot of the leaders back then poorly understood what it really meant, right? They
Yep.
thought they heard cost savings, they heard it's trendy, right? And they were trying to do adoption without really putting the correct bracing around it so that they, if they ran into a problem, they could survive the impact, right? That a lot of that, and that's kind of part and parcel with a lot of the problems we see in adoptive change, right?
Yep.
Excuse me. But the leaders involved today are having the same problem with AI. They largely do not understand all the parameters that are involved with risk as AI exists in their organization. And that can, again, be from the attacker standpoint or it can be from the utilization standpoint. We don't really have tools today, it's enterprise tools that can do quality data loss prevention functions to prevent employees from doing that stuff. There's always a way that it can get through. And
Sure.
nature seeks the path of least resistance, right? Some, with employees may just try to find a way to do that regardless of what you put on your systems. There's a multitude of opportunities for them to take that machine and take that data and run it through their own home PC. So from the standpoint of, I think we're in for a big experience in figuring out what these consequences are. I think some of them are off a little ways, like
Sure.
how that ends up coming back to us. But for the, being just a practical operator and having seen changes like the same thing with cloud, I think we're going to have to see how this evolves a little bit and see how, organizations, what kinds of costs come from this. And that will be a new metrics frontier to say, what is it that we care about in
Yeah.
our AI considerations and concerns? And it's kind of exciting, but at the same time, there's a lot of risk that needs to be quantified there.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things we're sort of little too quick to discard is all of the ways that we've evaluated new technology, new capabilities in the past. It's a tool. Your underlying business is doing similar things or the same thing. It's a tool that layers on top of that that has the potential to introduce risk, just like, situate your earlier analogy, situating your manufacturing plant and Penang has certain risks that go with it. Using generative AI in order to take a piece of your workflow and be able to make that more efficient theoretically, or to
Mhm.
create a cost savings has risk associated with it. I think they're poorly understood right now, and that's part of the challenge that goes with all of this around security, because you're not just introducing a new and different technology, you're forcing people to think differently about risk.
Yeah, this industry is really good at consistently creating a new Wild West every time it's like there's always some, kind of land of undiscovered for us to wander into. And again, it's that sort of path of least resistance piece. Like improve things to reduce workloads and improve efficiency. And that's really what the story of all of these transformations have been: cloud, AI, and all of them come with some important lessons learned. And I think it's incumbent upon operators like Evolving Solutions to try to, look forward, try to use the crystal ball that we have in terms of the way we, consider the industry, consider the threatscape, look at the what's possible, and then from that, make abstractions to give our clients who typically don't have a lot of time to kind of sit around and postulate or, think about the world at length like that and be those trusted advisors that way. I think that's the partner community can really help this the industry players and security, the enterprise organizations, commercial, really think about this from a cost standpoint, a risk standpoint, a metric standpoint. And we're going to go through this the same way we did with cloud, albeit I suspect much faster. But yeah, there is that wild west that we have in AI. It's there's a lot of obfuscation. We really don't understand a lot about how it's going, and it's moving impossibly fast. Like we
Yeah,
just, it's Moore's law begun, right? Like we're
yeah,
way past that kind of calculation.
absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you that my experience talking to clients has been they're looking for some insight, right? They're looking for some understanding of how it applies to their business. And yeah, we're in the fortunate position of seeing a lot of vendors and a lot of clients and a lot of uh, service providers in the industry, and being able to have a unique perspective on sort of some of what the trends are and where things might be out in the future. So
Yeah, and it's the multi-edge value of the data that you have at your fingertips, whether you collect it today or not, across your IT telemetry or your business intelligence, is that, the value of AI is that it draws from these large language models that include, wide-ranging edges of data and organizations. I think the big transformative moment or opportunity is that organizations can move from just having logging and monitoring or even just observability, but thinking about enabling themselves as their own living LLM and then finding a way to, encapsulate that value such that somebody in finance a junior, accountant in finance can say in the natural language, hey, I'm really interested in seeing what the costs of X, Y, or Z was over a 3 month period. And, please take into account the weather in Penang, right? Like, and
yeah,
then and that those business intelligence values or those risk elements can be withdrawn from the organization by people in the same way that attackers do in AI in this future brand version where they don't need to have any technical skill, that we can enable people who are not necessarily domain experts to ask questions that don't require syntax for full effect.
absolutely. And so one more question before we go then, how does that play into cybersecurity skills?
That's a great question. So first, it's the sort of the nobility of knowing, risk, like what's risky to be doing with these tools, or understanding the potential for risk at a very fundamental level, understanding that, these GPTs operate, with an LLM that is the aggregate of its experiences, right? That it's sort of quantum. If you touch it, you affect it, right? You're part of
Yep.
it forever. Understanding some of those fundamentals, I think, for security operators coming in today is essential. Then, and to be fair, the last 12 years, the security tool manufacturer landscape is thrown around, air quotes here, AI and ML, right? For with kind of exhaustively, and in a lot of cases, that wasn't truly what was going on. Now I think we're getting a place where that's actually happening, right? Like they are applying the science in the way that we are the contemporary notion of AI. And with that, I think there'll be it's going to be a it's going to be a moment where the client or the enterprise will have so much granularity of information available to it that it will have to ask very specific questions and understand the questions it needs to ask, like a
Hmm.
more beautiful question, if you will, about
Yeah.
their environment. The real opportunity is to embrace talent that can ask more beautiful questions. And because it's no longer the constraint that you have to have some technical knowledge of how to fire up the answer machine,
Right.
it will be there sort of as a default. It's really, can you ask the right questions to derive the reality that you need to act against?
Yeah, I like that. That's absolutely true, not just in cybersecurity, but everywhere. Is
That's right.
how do you change the way you look for the core skills you need from the people who work for you? So
Yeah. Yep.
awesome. Thank you, Russ. I really appreciate your time today and your insights. Great conversation.
My pleasure always. Yep.
Hopefully, I'll have you join again in a few months, and would love to get some additional insight on what you're seeing out there.
It'd be a pleasure. Thank you, Michael.
All right. Thanks, Russ. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of ModOps Pod, the Modern Operations Podcast. In this episode, we explored security trends and solutions with Russ Steiger. Russ has some really innovative thoughts around security and how to best operationalize it. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please feel free to connect with me. And as always, follow Evolving Solutions on LinkedIn to stay up to date with the latest episodes.